Hi, everyone, and welcome. Please let me know that you can hear me. You can see my wonderful panelists. You can see our title slide. Let me know by saying happy Thursday and let us know where you're broadcasting from. So happy Thursday from New York City. I'm pretty sure Matthew and Alexandra are broadcasting from Washington, D.C. And Daniel is from San Francisco, right? All right. Let me know. Wonderful. We have a bunch of people tuning in. So we have the Bay Area, Boston, Washington, Chicago, Atlanta, Raleigh, upstate New York, Vegas. I'm looking for my hometown of New Jersey. I don't see it yet. Jersey, all right, there we go. Jersey Shore. Wonderful. All right. Thank you everybody for joining, and let's get started. Happy Thursday to everybody. And hello, good morning, and good afternoon to in-house counsel and in-house legal professionals from all across North America and the world. Welcome to In-House Connect. My name is Shai Mahani. I'm the CEO and co-founder of In-House Connect, and I'm thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast time or your lunchtime with us, or possibly even your dinner time. And special thanks to our wonderful sponsor, LegalOn Technologies, and our fantastic presenters today. We have Matthew Ferraro, Alexandra Seymour, and our moderator extraordinaire, Daniel Lewis, who are going to teach us about how to navigate the U.S. AI regulation and government policy for in-house counsel. This is our 42nd event of the year, although to be honest, I'm not sure how to count the events anymore, but we'll say it's the 42nd one. If you're here for the first time, let us know, and please take the poll. While you're taking the poll, I have some quick housekeeping announcements. First, as always at In-House Connect, we want you, our dear audience, to get involved in the program, and here's some guidance on how to do that. First, we have a couple of great polls coming your way, so please participate in the polls when you see it pop up. Additionally, please get active in the chat box. There's so many have already. Here's some guidance on getting active in the chat box. The first thing we love to encourage is networking. We have helped thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people connect offline through our webinars. How does one network at a webinar? It's very simple. Draft a blurb about yourself. Tell us who you are, where you're from, what you do, where you're located, and include a link to your LinkedIn profile page. Take that blurb, put it in the chat, and voila. Networking. People will connect with you, you can connect with others, and then you can take the relationships offline and go from there. It's really a pleasure to facilitate so many connections, and we're happy to do it. So feel free to get started, and thank you to Brett for getting us started. Additionally, the chat is great for comments and questions. It's going to be a fun panel and a lot of great information as always. So feel free to drop comments, ask questions. We will try our best to get to all the questions, but if not, you can connect with the panel offline and ask your questions there. Keep in mind that the chat box is recorded. It is publicly available and may be shared. So keep that in mind as you engage in the chat box. So that's the chat box. The next thing I want to talk about is CLE. So please listen carefully. If you're pursuing CLE credit, I will be announcing 2 course codes throughout the course of the program. You'll write the course codes down and then put it into the CLE submission form, which you should have received via email. My colleague Bethany is going to be sharing links to those resources, the CLE form and the slides. So keep your eye on the chat if you didn't receive it, and please double check your emails to make sure you received it. Please get your CLE submission form back to us by May 23rd, which is a week from today. My advice, do it ASAP. Once you get the second code, you can fill out the form so you don't forget. As well, your Zoom name has to match up with your actual name. So I see somebody whose name is 106034. So whoever that is, if you are seeking CLE credit, you have to rename yourself. So right click on yourself in the Zoom client, put your full name, and then we can issue you CLE credit. If you have trouble with that, you can message me and I can rename you for you. Any questions, comments, concerns, you can email cle@inhouseconnect.org. That's cle@inhouseconnect.org, and you can message Bethany directly if you have any questions. And we do have PDFs available if your organization does not agree with Google or there's firewall or whatever. So any questions, comments, concerns, you can email cle@inhouseconnect.org. As far as upcoming events, Monday or next week, we have almost a packed schedule. Monday, May 20th, we have enterprise SaaS agreements for in-house counsel. Tuesday, we have keys for drafting a generative AI use policy. And Wednesday, we have two wonderful programs, navigating the EU AI Act. So this is the US, version of that topic, and we're going to do the EU version on Wednesday. And then at 4 o'clock on Wednesday, Humans of Legal Tech, I get to interview the founder of a company called LawView. I'm really excited. Definitely tune in if you're able to. And then last but not least, in a couple of weeks, or I guess maybe 3 weeks from now, in person only in New York City, we're hosting a in-person panel event and a networking session afterwards. It's on sales contract negotiations, best practices for in-house counsel. I'm going to be there in person. I would love to see everybody as well. So sign up if you haven't already, and I'll share links to that in the chat. Last but not least, if you want to support In-House Connect, please help spread the word by telling your in-house legal department about us. Tell everybody. It's free CLE and our topics are great. And we have the best speakers like we do today. Yeah, please help us out. And that's it. Let's get to today's program, Navigating U.S. AI Regulation and Government Policy for In-House Counsel. It's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, our maestro, Daniel Lewis. Daniel is the U.S. CEO of LegalOn Technologies. Daniel is a recognized leader in advancing legal technology with 10 plus years at the industry's cutting edge. He is the U.S. CEO of LegalOn Technologies, a global leader in AI contract review, trusted by over 3,800 legal teams globally for pre-signature contract review. Daniel, wonderful to have you back. Please take us away.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be back with In-House Connect. We're excited to be here for another great webinar on generative AI for in-house legal. Over the last several months, we've hosted a few different webinars on the current state of AI-related litigation, and today we're turning to Capitol Hill. So through my work at LegalOn, I hear almost every day about how GCs are at the forefront in navigating the opportunities and legal issues related to this exciting new technology, both in their legal departments and more broadly across the business. So we've put together this series of AI webinars to help legal teams in this work. As Shai mentioned, my name's Daniel. I'm the US CEO of LegalOn Technologies. I started in legal tech after graduating from law school, founding and leading a company called Ravel Law, which helped pioneer the use of data analytics and visualization in legal research. After LexisNexis acquired Ravel, I led several business units at Lexis, including practical guidance and analytical content across the US, the UK, and Canada. And now at LegalOn, we help legal teams review contracts faster by combining cutting-edge AI with practical guidance to help find and fix contract risks instantly before signature. So while we get to know today's panelists, we'd also like to get to know the audience. Please answer the poll questions about your practice and your AI interests. That'll help us make sure that we dial in the conversation to what everybody here cares about. I'm really excited to be joined today with two of the leading policy experts on AI regulation on Capitol Hill. Alexandra Seymour is the Majority Staff Director for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee within the House Homeland Security Committee. And Matthew Ferraro is the Senior Counselor for Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology to the Secretary of Homeland Security. So I'm going to turn it over to Alexandra and Matt for a bit more introduction. Alexandra, would you mind going first and telling us a little bit more about yourself?
Of course, it's great to be here with you all, and thanks so much for the kind introduction, Daniel, and excited to be here with Matt for this discussion today. So as Daniel mentioned, I'm Alexandra Seymour. I'm with the House Homeland Security Committee, where I'm the staff director for our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee. So we cover all things cybersecurity across the federal government. Our main jurisdiction is over the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, which sits within DHS. And previously, before this role, I was also on the Hill. I served with the Senate Commerce Committee, where I was leading our work on artificial intelligence, CHIPS and Science Act implementation, quantum issues, basically all emerging tech issues. And prior to that, I had come from a research background. I had worked at the Center for a New American Security, where I did technology research to include AI, And I've also worked at the Department of Defense, as well as with an AI security company, which was kind of where I had started out within the tech space, working for a small 25-person startup doing our policy work and serving as chief of staff. So excited to get into this with you all and talk about how the landscape has evolved.
Awesome. Thank you. And Matt?
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be with you all. Wonderful to be with you, Daniel and Alexandra and Shai. It's really wonderful to be here. I would just say I've known Daniel since law school. So I knew Daniel from when he was founding that company that went on to be a huge success. And Alexandra's an old friend as well, in addition to now being my oversight, since she, as you said, oversees CISA, which falls under DHS. So my job is this long title, Senior Counselor for Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology to the Secretary of Homeland Security. Basically, the Secretary's advisor on cyber and emerging tech. Emerging tech is artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space issues, Internet of Things, sometimes called connected communities, and all that good stuff. I'm basically on my third career. My first career is I was an intel officer with the U.S. government in D.C. with the DNI and the CIA in my 20s. And then when I was 29 years old, I went off to law school where I met Daniel, and I clerked, and then I worked for many years at a law firm called Wilmer Hale, which is here in Washington, D.C. And I helped build our AI practice. I also did a lot of national security law work and things like that. And I met there the person who is now the Secretary of Homeland Security, Secretary Mayorkas. He was a partner at Wilmer. And so I was recruited to come and take this job last year. In this position, I advise the Secretary. I also serve as something called the Executive Director of the Artificial Intelligence Safety and Security Board, which is a board that was established after the President signed an executive order on AI last year. And the Secretary chairs the board, and it's of various tech leaders, owners and operators in critical infrastructure and civil rights and civil liberties organizations. And its remit is to make recommendations for the safe, secure, and responsible deployment of AI in critical infrastructure, which I'll just pause to say is a term of art, which refers to the various sectors of the US economy whose survival is key for economic prosperity and national security. So it's a fun job, it's a large remit, and I'm very excited to be here today to talk about all these interesting issues. Daniel, back to you.
Awesome. So let's get into it. So AI is not new to the policy arena, but the explosion of interest around GPT and generative AI seems to have brought it into focus and brought more attention to it. So Matt, could you help orient us to what is Gen AI and what implications does Gen AI GPT have for AI regulation?
Sure, and I think I'm glad we're starting with this because in an audience this large, I'm not exactly sure what everyone knows. So I think it's helpful to baseline. I mean, some of you are probably very well aware of these technologies and others maybe less so. And in presentations in the past, I've found that it's just helpful to talk through the acronym GPT and ChatGPT. You've all heard of ChatGPT, but what does that actually stand for? What it stands for, as we can see on the slide here, Generative Pre-trained Transformer. And so if we just walk iteratively through those three, generative means it creates something new, right? New text, new video, new imagery based on human inputs. Often natural language inputs. Now increasingly you can speak to these things, but it's going to create something new. It is not merely a predictive model where it makes some sort of prediction. This is going to create media. The second is it's pre-trained, right? So generative models that you use today, if you use ChatGPT or Copilot, they've been trained on terabytes upon terabytes of data. Libraries of Congress is full of data, usually over several years. I read somewhere that ChatGPT 3.5, which is a lesser model, a less recent model, if you wanted to read everything that ChatGPT 3.5 had read, it would take you 2,000 years reading nonstop. So you better get started. So it's just far more than any human could read, and so it reads all of that. And then the transformer bit is there we are, the third T, the third acronym, and that is essentially the kind of algorithm that it uses, and it's a pattern reproducing neural network architecture that transforms an input into a context-dependent output, which is to say, it's an algorithm that can draw inferences based on context, which is really one of the great innovations when it came to AI. And this developed only within the last 10 years, but that's the kind of training that it does. So it creates something new after having been trained for a very long period of time on lots and lots of data. And in that training, it learns to recognize patterns, and it can then, of course, reproduce those patterns in response to prompts. So that is ChatGPT. Daniel, you asked a follow-on question, which is how is the challenges distinct? I mean, I think that we'll get into that as we go through this discussion, but I'll just kick it off by saying it's important to think about all the things that are involved, like all the elements that go into this kind of system. So you have a lot of data, right? So you have to think about data ownership, who owns it, whether the data is biased in one way or the other, whether it's fully representative. It takes a lot of computing power, referred to as compute. So someone needs to own that compute or lease it or run it. That kind of compute takes a lot of energy, take a lot of resources, a lot of silicon chips. And so like that's a concern. And then the algorithms themselves, the kind of transformer algorithms, those are a form of intellectual property. They're very valuable. And that's the kind of thing that there's an open debate whether or not those algorithms are the crown jewels that need to be protected or belong to humanity. So that's a very brief overview of some of these issues. Over.
Yeah. No, thank you. So Alexandra, maybe one other high-level framing question from your perspective. In some ways, it feels like regulators are acting more swiftly vis-a-vis this new technology than we've seen over the last 10 years. And I'm curious how you put that into perspective compared to, say, maybe the sense that regulators feel like they acted too slow when it came to the emergence of social media and did not get ahead of wanting to regulate some of the eventual things that concerned them about data and privacy and other things. So how would you compare that? Is there sort of a reaction going on here that's swifter to AI based on some prior experiences over the last 10, 15 years?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So I think just double down on one thing that Matt said, and I think that has distinguished this from other forms of AI that we've seen in the past is just the amount of compute and the amount of data that is going into these models. And I think that's really what grabbed everybody's attention. Because like you said, we've been using artificial intelligence for decades. It's mostly been machine learning models. So it has been more predictive in nature. You're trying to get to more accuracy when you're applying these applications. Whereas now we're seeing, and I think what really took everyone by surprise was just how these large generative AI models, especially starting with large language models around ChatGPT, was able to create new content. And that was something that just felt different, I think, to everybody because of the amount of data and the compute that we've seen. And so I think it just kind of marked an inflection point where you had a lot of attention coming from it across society because they're interacting with this new technology, which is more general purpose. And there's a lot of things that you can do with it. And I think as people have become more comfortable, they realized all the different applications that they can have for it. And across the government, we've seen a lot of really interesting use cases that I think we'll get into as well as we go on and have this discussion, particularly as relates to DHS, since that's what Matt and I, the realm that we both work in. But I think because of that, it's just raised a lot of interesting societal questions. It's raised some of those national security concerns as well, where Matt kind of alluded to computer chips. I mentioned before that one of the things I had focused on was semiconductors, and there are a lot of interesting questions in the semiconductor race too, for interest in developing the most powerful chips, the advanced computing chips, because those are the ones that are going to power AI models, having access to data, having access to quality data. And so I think these are just a lot of questions that we haven't had to face. And because beforehand, when we didn't have these more advanced generative AI models, and because of the level of interest, I think it's spurring a reaction that it's something that we need to address. Now, I think that you're right. There are some that will draw parallels to beforehand with the internet or with social media as a moment. And I think there are divergent opinions on how we should approach that question. I think at least for members, I think especially as this issue kind of started coming to the fore, there was first the feeling of, we need to address something. There's a lot of concern around artificial intelligence. There's these new applications. But I think really where members have been is really taking a step back and educating and learning about the nuances in this technology, trying to address, understand some of these bigger questions and understanding exactly where existing laws are and where the gaps are. So I think that's where a lot of the conversation is. And in terms of figuring out, even if it's on the regulation question, it might not be when, but if, where. I think those are all kind of on the table right now, and exactly what that looks like. And I think, there are some that, I guess, as a short answer, there are some that have drawn those parallels. I don't think that some are as convinced about the need to react in the same way. But we are addressing, there is interest in looking at a broad swath of questions, with this kind of being the center point of when and if and how to regulate.
Yeah. And so, Matt, as regulation that relates to AI happens at different levels, how are we seeing, maybe you could walk us through these sort of different regulatory layers that can come into being here?
Sure. Yeah, this is I think a helpful slide because regulation isn't just one thing; it's many things. And so the top is federal legislation. This is a law passed by both houses of Congress, presented to the president, and signed. There is no comprehensive federal legislation. You all might have been tracking that Senator Schumer and 3 other senators released a roadmap yesterday that hinted towards some potential for legislation. Your guess is as good as mine if anything can get passed this year. Just generally speaking, a big comprehensive legislation is difficult. We're still waiting on a comprehensive data privacy law, and that hasn't come along. So, we'll see if we get one on AI. I do think you're going to probably have some narrower, you might have narrower provisions that are in these sort of omnibus bills like the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which has to pass every year, which is the main Defense Department policy bill. And if you all have ever read it, I mean, it's enormous and it's a bit of a Christmas tree. I mean, it has lots of stuff that hangs on there. So there might be some more defense focused applications or issues around AI in that. So that's something to look for. There is, of course, the use of other existing authorities to help regulate AI. And in an executive order, I think we're going to talk more about it, it directs, it's inwardly focused. It directs what agencies do. Although this executive order does have one provision that is outwardly focused that uses something called the Defense Production Act to compel reporting on red teaming by certain tech companies of their certain AI models. But it is, generally inwardly focused. You do, of course, have the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, DOJ Civil Rights Division, and all of those have broad powers that can, I think, be applied reasonably to certain use cases that implicate AI. And here, we talk about on the slide here, AI washing and false advertising. The SEC has brought actions against companies that are saying they're using AI when they're not. And the FTC has also brought claims and begun investigations, let me be clear, into certain tech companies under their authorities under the Federal Trade Act. So like that's an area where I think you're going to see a lot more. And speaking to a lot of in-house lawyers, I think this is an area where you should expect more government kind of regulation. And that is a good segue to state legislation, because I think, well, actually, I'm going to just say state regulation or existing authorities. So let me just make that connection, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right? So you have the SEC and the FTC at the federal level. In certain states, you have very empowered state regulators. California comes to mind, Massachusetts, and New York, and the financial division. And so they are going to use a lot of their authorities to compel investigations. People are going to get letters. Again, very similar, I think, to what you've seen in the data privacy realm. And that is absent state legislation. So moving up our chart here. And that's an area where, for a lot of reasons, some of them structural, states pass a lot more laws, right? Some of it is because there's tends to be uniform party control in states, so it's more like a parliament. If the party in charge decides they want to pass something, they will. Also, there's just a lot more state laws, as you all know, right? There actually tend to be very few federal criminal laws, many more state laws. When we go about our day-to-day lives, are much more likely to be regulated by state laws than federal laws. And so you've seen a lot more action at the state level when it comes to AI laws, when it comes to legislation related to specific uses like deep fakes, synthetic imagery, both in the election context and increasingly in what's referred to as non-consensual intimate imagery, which is the idea that you create a nude image, a pornographic image that didn't exist in reality, and it's either of a manipulated person, so the face of a non-consenting person, or it's just a completely manipulated image, a completely synthesized image of a person who did not exist. And we've seen, I think there's going to be a chart later on, but like many states now have laws against that. Not a ton of prosecutions, but a lot of laws. And so I think you'll see much more state activity. And then the final bullet here is international regulation, because of course there is them too. These are all international companies. The reason that you have to accept cookies on every website you go to is because of the GDPR in Europe. And EU has passed the EU AI Act, which is probably the most aggressive regulatory regime out there outside of, say, China. And there are also other international agreements like the Bletchley Park Declaration, the Hiroshima Declaration. These are sort of aspirational claims, but they begin to set a framework of what is considered appropriate by international bodies when it comes to AI. So it's just to say that it's a very active and interesting space, and I expect more of this to follow. Over.
That's great. Oh yes, Alexandra, you want to jump in?
Yeah. I just wanted to add in something. I think, and we'll get more into the state level legislation, but I think one thing that's been really interesting watching those trends is, I think one thing that we've kind of noticed is when we talk about AI, even though oftentimes the conversation is about generative AI, we kind of talk about this as this just catch-all term and don't often become very specific about what we are talking about specifically. And under artificial intelligence, there's lots of different types of AI. It could be machine learning, deep learning, generative AI. It uses different types of data. It has different applications. So really, a lot of the times, and when your AI is going to work the best is when it has these more narrow use cases. And so I think one thing that's going to be interesting to watch, especially with all the state legislation popping up, is that it's much closer to the source for the application where it will be used. And so I think as Matt said, we kind of saw this with data privacy, and where it's been very patchwork up to this point. Whereas with AI, while it will be a little more patchwork, it will be a lot closer to the source for the most part for these specific applications. So I think it's just something that overall we're going to be looking at to see how this kind of plays out on the state level and how effective that it is.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we won't talk much about it today, but the EU Act, you can see some of this too, where it's sort of different levels of regulatory scrutiny depending on which space the AI is being applied to. AI in judicial decision making is going to get a lot more scrutiny than AI in some less contentious space. So
yeah, the other last quick point I'll make is on international regulation, where Matt pointed to the EU AI Act. I think a lot of the conversation is also, as he mentioned, with frameworks. It's broad standard setting. Like you have the ESEU, the Trade and Technology Council. A lot of it is in these, what are these broader principles, frameworks that we can all agree upon, and then try to build from there. So I think we're seeing a lot of activity like that bilaterally and multilateral forums. And I think it's just something that will continue to be of interest as we swap lessons learned.
And Daniel, I'm going to jump in and announce our first CLE code, which is LO as in LegalOn, LO1213. That is LO1213. The code is in the chat as well. As a reminder, your Zoom name has to match up with your actual name. Back to you, Daniel, Matt, and Alexandra.
So these are the different kind of regulatory actors in the space. Let's turn now to the executive order. This is perhaps the most comprehensive framework so far relating to this kind of new interest in regulating AI in the US. It establishes a framework for responsible AI development and deployment. It adopts a whole government approach and tasks various agencies with implementing its directives. So for those in the audience who are less familiar with this executive order, Matt and Alexandra, could you guys talk us through its basic components and how it will be implemented and what the concerns are that the EO is primarily aimed at?
I'm happy to kick us off. So there's the president signing it in that photo there. I was in that room. I thought there'd be food. There were no snacks. I was a little disappointed. But other than that, it was a great morning. So yeah, here it is. Oh, perfect. I was gonna go through this, but here are the key principles. That AI must be safe and secure. It must promote responsible innovation, competition, and collaboration. It must support American workers, advance equity and civil rights, protect consumers, patients, and students, protect privacy and civil liberties, ensure responsible and effective government use of AI, advance American leadership abroad. Let me pause here actually, and just it occurs to me, Daniel, it might help if I give just a little bit of background, like where this all came from. So ChatGPT comes out in November of 2022. That is, I think, a real inflection point when it comes to the realization of how important AI is and is going to be. As Alexandra has said, AI has been around forever. AI is at work right now, reducing the feedback that you hear from my microphone. It's at use when your spam is diverted to your spam folder and doesn't end up in your inbox. But all of a sudden, the power is so much greater. The potential to seemingly replace jobs and impersonate individuals is so much greater. So the White House realizes that this is a priority. I think everybody does. It's one of those rare moments. And so the decision is made that there should be that the president can move quickest with an executive order, and that there's a real need to align the federal government, right? Because we're this huge government, we have lots of different things moving lots of different directions, and there's a lot of potential risks, right, that are related to federal equities. And so a man named Ben Buchanan, who is the president's senior advisor on AI, is sort of on point to pull this together. I think they gave him like 60 days to write it, and through a strong interagency process, maybe it took a little bit longer than that, but they put together what is, I believe, to be the longest executive order that we've ever had. I mean, it's like, I think it's 100 pages printed out if it's double spaced. So it's 22,000 words. I mean, it's extraordinary, something like that. So it covers a lot of ground. You can see that here on the slide. And I think that most important is this notion that it needs to be safe and secure. That we don't want AI to be used to create existential risks that are going to decimate the population, that are going to expose us to pathogens. We don't want AI to be able to create diseases that have no cures, things of that nature. I think that is really the fundamental concern. But then there are these subsidiary concerns, because of course, and the vice president said this in one of her speeches, we worry about existential risk, but if you're someone who's the victim of non-consensual intimate imagery, of deepfake porn, it's pretty existential to you. And if you lose your job because of an AI, that can feel pretty existential. So we have to worry about all of those other sort of subsidiary elements as well. And what the federal government has largely done, there is this compulsory part. The one compulsory part is that AI companies are required to submit to the Department of Commerce under something called the Defense Production Act Authority the results of red teaming, basically safety testing their models if their models are a certain kind of power, a certain kind of compute. And that's basically a way of making sure that they're being properly tested, right? But everything else is about aligning the government, preparing reports, and there's been a lot of action here. We've moved pretty quickly. I think, Daniel, you asked what the biggest challenges are. The biggest challenges are that the timelines are short, right? I mean, the president signed the EO in October. We just hit 6 months, and we had a number of things that were due at 6 months, which we're proud to say we've met them all. And they're things like a report. I mentioned pathogens, like a report on the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear risks of AI and how to mitigate those. That was a report that was sent to the president. We've done sector risk assessments of all of the different critical infrastructure sectors and how they're dealing with risks of AI. Like those were all finished. There's been a pilot to detect vulnerabilities in DoD, Defense Department, sensitive networks, and others. Like we've done that. And one that I also highlight is that this is hats off to an organization called the Office of Personnel Management that runs all federal hiring. They've done a lot to expedite the hiring of AI experts through particular authorities that they have. And so we've used those authorities, certainly at DHS and elsewhere, to launch something called the DHS AI Core, which is 50 employees that we announced it in February. We made our first hires like 2 months later, which for the federal government is at rocket speed. And we got something like 5,000 applications for 50 jobs on the federal pay scale. And there's some really top people. And I think it's because, and this is where I'll wrap this answer up, it's because people recognize all of these risks, right? And I think for technologists out there who maybe are a little bit tired maximizing how long a user spends on their ad for their company and using AI to make sure that they wring the lightest penny out of someone's pocket. Not that there's anything wrong with that, I'm a total capitalist, but they might also look for other opportunities to address the dangers of AI, and working for the federal government is one way to do that. Over.
So that's a super helpful background, and you gave us a flavor for how it's impacting federal agencies. It sounds like step one is some scoping and reporting and starting to continue that education of trying to identify risks, starting to do some hiring. Alexandra, how has the executive order influenced the approach of policymakers on the Hill? What's been the reaction from stakeholders outside of the agencies?
Yeah, and one thing I just want to tack on to Matt's very excellent overview is there's actually one part that we're waiting for. So while the whole executive order is very comprehensive, it touches almost every single agency and tasks them on these short timelines to execute, whether it's reporting requirements or standing up like different offices or positions or hiring, et cetera. A lot of the national security specific use cases, they're going, the White House is working on a separate document to address those. Because I think, like we said, we can't really just bucket AI as this one thing. We have to recognize some of the nuances, and this is a broad technology category that's going to have impacts on the economy and our national security interests. And so we need to pay attention to those nuances. So that's something we're looking out for. They did address some of it, as Matt had mentioned, like the critical infrastructure provisions, some of the cybersecurity, some of the more higher risk use cases that we're fearful putting some of those structures in place, but otherwise we're still waiting on that. So now to your question about, I just wanted to make sure to make that distinction. So I think from the Hill perspective, I think it's something that we have been watching closely. Just from, I'll say from my own observations, having worked in the AI space for a bit, a lot of the attention, I think, for AI from a policy perspective really has come more from the defense side, where we've seen things come through the NDAA. We've seen attention from the Defense Department looking to harness AI, looking at the ethical implications. They were kind of leading in this space with developing ethical principles. And now I think since we had this ChatGPT moment, there's a lot broader interest where even just over the past year, almost every committee has had some type of AI hearing. Actually, my committee has an AI hearing next week. So it just shows like how cross-cutting it is, how many issues are touched by this and how we need to address it. So I think given the level of interest and how we're still working through a lot of these conversations, I think we've looked to the AI executive order since it is being implemented very quickly. I think some of it is a good test case to be able to see what works and what doesn't, and to get some of those structures in place. So I think mostly from the standpoint it's monitoring. one of the things that I think of particular interest for Congress, there's been within the executive order, there was a call for a pilot program of the National AI Research Resource. So I think that has gone into effect. If you read the Senate AI working group paper that had come out, I saw that there was a nod to that as well. There is legislation for that specifically. So those discussions are still playing out on the Hill. I mean, that's just one example of where you can kind of see the connection between the two documents. But otherwise, I think the Hill is looking to it and seeing how things play out, and is also taking the time to take a step back and understand where the gaps are in laws and figuring out where to address them.
Thanks. So if we could maybe put a point on this executive order section, and then we'll zoom back out again. What do you guys think businesses need to know today coming out of the EO that could impact them from a compliance and business perspective?
Yeah, I think to start, I think that is one open-ended question, especially, I guess, two things. One, with some of the reporting requirements, or like Matt pointed to the use of the DPA, or there's another section that looks at federal procurement. And there was an accompanying memo that came out of OMB that goes through all the types of tests that companies will have to go through in order for them to go through the procurement process. So I think that is one example, probably the most tangible example of what this implementation will look like, and understanding what types of tests and that they're going to have to pass through in order to be able to do work with the federal government. But a lot of it is still kind of up in the air, where when you have an executive order, it really leaves it upon departments and agencies to do the implementation piece and to figure out how it's best going to work. And so I think those are some open-ended questions right now about what it could look like, even with that DPA provision that Matt pointed to. And there are a couple other layers to that as well. I think they're also able to request model weights and cybersecurity practices around the model weights and some other things. So I think it will depend how, for example, Commerce decides to use that authority, what specifically they request, if they change the thresholds. Some of that is defined as a base level within the executive order. And I think that companies, it's one way that we can take a look as what might be to come, but it at least is the framework to start looking at as companies are thinking through this. Matt, I don't know if you have anything to add on to that.
That was good. I would make three quick additional points. One is, and the in-house crowd here is going to love this, the best advice that you can give businesses is to talk to your lawyers. I mean, that's because so much of this is complicated, it's detailed, and it changes. That really the first step is to begin with talking to your in-house and outside counsel. The second is, it will depend a bit on the kind of company, because there are companies that are going to be subject to different kind of regulatory regimes that are, again, sort of irrespective of their particular AI applications. Like, they're not like sui generis for AI, but if you're like a transportation company, you're subject to a lot more regulation under the TSA than some other regular company that isn't. And so, ditto with an energy company. And so those sorts of companies that are just generally more subject to regulation should expect regulation as it relates to these instances too. Financial through SEC would be another example. And the third thing I would say is, I think that whether it's the EO, the White House put out a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. Those things are important to read and understand, because you kind of get a flavor of the sorts of concerns, honestly, the things that we're talking about now, like the concerns that people have, that regulators have around AI, that even if the regulation now or the guidance now doesn't impact your business, it kind of points you in the direction of travel. And so I think it just gives you a sense of what people are looking for. Over.
Awesome. So it sounds like folks are going to need to be paying close attention to this. There's still more that's unfolding. And then further, the executive order is not all encompassing. So zooming out, there are a range of other impacts of this technology across data privacy and disinformation and IP and bias. The list goes on. where do you guys see the other laws and sort of regulatory tools, courts included in that, that are coming into play here? Where do potential gaps exist? And maybe while there are not AI-specific laws in place, that doesn't mean that other laws aren't going to be applied. So how do you guys think about the ways in which each of these sort of use case or application specific impacts might be handled? And for folks who are in-house dealing with these various concerns, where are the places that they should be paying attention?
I'm happy to kick it off. I think, and that's really the right question, because we're not quite sure. These are all risks, but risks, of course, vary in magnitude, both in terms of whether or not they're black swans, low probability, high impact, or high probability, low impact. I would point to intellectual property as to me kind of the stalking horse, because there's lots of litigation going on. Back when I was in private practice, I used to have associates. Wasn't that great? And I had associates, and I had them follow the litigation and keep me updated on the various claims that were being brought. It's certainly within the realm of possible that some of these models might find the data on which they were trained to be ordered to be disgorged by a court. I mean, I wouldn't say it's likely, but it's certainly possible. That's one of those low probability, high risk events, because if that were to happen, the model is just sort of dead. And there have been regulators that have done that in other cases where the data was found to be inappropriate or inappropriately used. And so that's an area that I think we should watch carefully. And there's a lawsuit in New York now. The New York Times is suing Microsoft and OpenAI and others. Very expansive claims. We'll be curious to see how that develops, and there's similar suits as well. So I think, Daniel, you asked who would make these decisions. I think in a case like that, that's going to probably be courts in the first instance, unless intellectual property laws are changed at the federal level. Interestingly as well, I didn't mention patentability, but there's been, it's been litigated already whether or not AI itself is able to, the AI is able to patent itself, as it were, like basically own the patent on its own creation. So far, the US PTO has said no, that you can only hold a patent if you're a human person, and an AI is not. So that's one. Data privacy is another one where I think you're going to see a lot of like other actors in this space, like data privacy authorities at the state level, issue questions and interrogatories to tech companies to make sure that the people's privacy, both in terms of the data that is being sucked up, but that's a bit attenuated, and also the user, right? If you go on one of these chatbots and are a user, like, I would suggest that you read the terms of service, and you'll recognize that you're giving up a whole lot of information to these systems. And there's probably that's fine, of course, if you're winning, but there's probably going to be some movement to make sure that users are winning. Cybersecurity is a huge deal. That is something that our agency focuses on, because you need cybersecurity for AI. AI itself is very valuable. The algorithms are valuable. The data is valuable. And so we, as a defensive agency, want to make sure that companies are properly protecting their valuables in that way. And then also we're worried about the use of AI for cyber attack, because AI can be used to search out vulnerabilities and zero-day exploits and things like that. Companies need to be ready for that. There's a great concern about social engineering exploitation, where they can use, and there's been some examples of this, and I might have seen it mentioned in one of the chat messages, the use of AI to impersonate trusted individuals to try to get access to classified systems or just confidential systems that you otherwise wouldn't want someone to get access to. Ditto with video. Like, that's a real concern. But then on the third hand, there's how can AI be used for cyber defense? How can it be used by the good guys? Final thing I'll say before I hand over to Alexandra is, questions around fraud, deepfakes, and disinformation I think are prevalent as well. We haven't really seen a market moving incident yet, but there's a certain level of nuisance with the use of synthetic media to defraud people. It could just become just a kind of ambient risk and ambient cost that becomes harder to bear, increases insurance premiums and that sort of thing. Over.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things onto that because I think Matt did a great job kind of walking through where some of the gaps might be. But I think it kind of speaks to that we're still determining where a lot of those gaps are. Just because you're applying an AI technology to a certain use case does not necessarily mean that it is not covered by existing law. And so I think part of this is also for us, and I think where the conversation is understanding in specific use cases, how much risk are you willing to accept before deploying the model, so that we're actually using the technology and seeing where those gaps might appear so that we then can address them. Because I think at this point, since the technology is evolving so quickly, we're still deploying it in certain applications, we're still learning a lot of things, and as we're continuing to use them, we're thinking about it in terms of risks that we might foresee. So it's a little bit of a push and pull where you want to make sure that you're using the AI in a way that is trustworthy and it's secure, that you're not exposing yourself to too much risk, but at the same time, you have to assume some level of risk so that you can actually see how the technology is going to perform with its specific use case, how well it does. So, and I think it goes all to say too, that AI is, it is an amplifying tool as well. It's going to make you more efficient. Some of these things that we've seen are issues that we deal with anyway. We've seen deepfakes now, they are better with generative AI because they can be more accurate and personalized. They can be sent out much more quickly, right? So I think that there are issues that we have been struggling with as well, but now there's an extra layer onto it. So I think it's for us to keep in mind that there are existing laws. We need to think about where they are, use the technologies. Also lean into, I'm glad that Matt highlighted even on the cybersecurity side, there's so many great applications for cyber defense and thinking about those tools that we can develop to help to get ahead of some of the issues that we might foresee, and to think about best practices. It's going to be ongoing just because the technology is changing, and we're going to find some of these gaps, but it's very complex, I think, is at the end of the day, and we're kind of balancing all of these different things as we're trying to harness the technology for the reasons that we see is that it has a lot of promise.
So you both particularly focus on the national security aspects of this, cyber as well as competitiveness. I'm curious your view on where else, or sort of across these issues, where are policymakers or agencies facing the greatest pressure from external stakeholders like industry, or where are their interests drawing them into with more focus? Maybe it's from consumers. So for example, there's a question in the chat around the impacts in life insurance and health insurance, algorithmic discrimination in one sense. Are there pressures coming to bear on the federal government from a policy and agency perspective that are more acute in some of these areas than others?
I can take that first. I think it speaks to just, sorry to harp back on a point that I made, is that it's very complex and there are a lot of different use cases, but I think you can see the thinking around that reflected in the different gatherings, the different bodies. Matt said that he is overseeing the AI Safety and Security Board. There are a lot of different stakeholders that are involved in that conversation. I think that and there's going to be more narrower uses of AI as well that are going to have particular stakeholders. So I don't know if there's necessarily any specific, there are lots of different stakeholders that are going to foresee or see issues as pertains to their specific use case. But I think in taking a step back and trying to address some of these broader questions as we're looking at it from a government perspective, there's a lot of different stakeholders that are engaged on these questions. And maybe Matt, maybe you have something to add on to that just from your own experience with the board.
No, I agree. I think that there's a lot of stakeholders are engaged. There's a lot of interest. I will just note, because the question did ask about insurance and civil rights and all that. I mean, that's an area where the laws exist already. We talked about where laws exist and where they don't. And I do think that there's a bit of trying to fitting the current civil rights laws to concerns now. And I will just make 2 points. One is this is a real concern, and I think in particular this administration is concerned about it. The president has talked about it at great length. And the second thing is, even in circumstances where it's not per se illegal, I think that there's going to be a lot of reputational pressure on companies from a reputational standpoint to make sure that their products aren't discriminating. And I use that term broadly. It's not just discriminating, but it's like furthering biases, models that create imagery that seem to further certain stereotypes around particular ethnic groups, things like that. That wouldn't be per se illegal, but it's not the kind of thing that companies want to be doing, just given their reputational concerns. Over.
So maybe another way of asking a slightly related question, and then we'll switch gears again, is where do you guys think the federal government is most likely to take action? Where are they likely to move the fastest, and where might the federal government take more of a wait and see approach?
I'd be curious to know what Alexandra says about Congress. I would say issues that are directly within our wheelhouse, to use a very DC term, but like cybersecurity issues are an area where I think we're going to take quick action. Where we can deploy like things like the DPA to get testing results, right? That's not particularly difficult. It's pre-existing authority. It's the kind of thing that we might otherwise do for sort of dangerous materials. And so I think we can expect action there. When it comes to like building explicit AI regulatory regimes, that would take more time and be less likely to happen, or at least happen soon. Over.
Yeah, I think it's hard to tell what will pass from a legislative standpoint. I do agree with Matt. I think typically the issues you kind of see come to the fore are a lot of the national security, the issues that have a national security nexus. And I do think in particular, just given how there's kind of two ends to the cybersecurity issue in particular, you have the, securing your AI systems, and you also have all of the great applications of AI for cyber defense. I think that would be probably an area of interest across the board.
Yeah.
And Daniel, I'm gonna just jump on, announce our second CLE code, which is LO as in legal on, LO 1225. So LO 1225. The code is in the chat as well. Over to you, Daniel.
So my guess is that in-house teams need to be preparing themselves for more state-by-state and court-by-court compliance as it relates to AI. Can you guys talk us through a bit of what you think is happening at the state level? Perhaps this slide can help illustrate the point, but Matt, you touched earlier in the conversation around a variety of states taking action on deepfakes, for example.
Right.
Maybe you could elaborate on that and sort of broaden it too.
Sure. I think in the first instance, you all should be concerned about narrowly tailored laws, which is good in the sense that they may or may not impact your business. Bad in the sense that there's going to be more of them. I think there are going to be more comprehensive laws, some that are already on the books that deal with analogous issues that would require attention. And then there are going to be some state laws that are purely around AI. So I'll just tick through very briefly those three buckets. On the narrowly tailored stuff, I'll just talk about deepfakes because it's an area of particular interest of mine. Basically, laws in this space fall into four categories. The first and by far the most common are state laws that bar non-consensual intimate imagery that are created by computers, aka deepfake porn. And there are just a ton of those now with increasing regularity because of concerns, particularly around like high school students being victims of this sort of thing. They're both criminal laws and there's civil laws. That is, of course, to say that victims can bring lawsuits. Unclear yet if that's actually had any kind of stifling effect. I mean, it just happens to be that there are just tons of deepfake porns out there, but now at least there's some avenues in a lot of these states. Second category is around elections, and I think we're going to be curious to see what happens in 2024 in this election year. Increasingly, states now have laws that bar certain deepfakes around elections at certain times, so within so many days of an election. And I say certain deepfakes because it's the kind of thing that is very context dependent, or fact dependent, I suppose I should say. So it's like, you know, if it has a disclaimer, it usually defeats liability. And it would have to be distributed, not just created, and distributed usually with, you know, the intent to deceive a voter, right? So you could say, well, if it's really clearly satirical, there's no intent to deceive, ergo no liability. Oftentimes, there are exceptions for satire, for like First Amendment carve-outs. Incidentally, they're not really those carve-outs for the non-consensual imagery, for I think reasons that we could appreciate. So like, I think it'll be very hard for these things to actually be litigated. So I think those sorts of election bills tend to be, it's not that they're messaging bills, but I think it's the idea that it's prompting perhaps candidates to take the safer path, which would be to like include a disclaimer or something like that. And it gives it gives some actions, a cause of action when there's a truly bad actor, right, who might impersonate, say, like the Secretary of State, who says, oh, the voting day has been moved to Wednesday, right, something like that. So the way that I've described this before is that think of it as a bullseye on a target, right? Like when it actually comes down to what kind of deepfakes that are election related are going to be illegal, it's going to be a very narrow bullseye, but that doesn't mean it's inconsequential. Right, it is because that could include things that are actually quite dangerous to the democratic process. Third category is that there's a movement now to create rights in one's digital likeness. So basically property rights in one's digital likeness. This happens in sort of two flavors. The first is to just extend pre-existing right of publicity protections, like that's what they're doing in California. And the second is to create new laws that create protections to right of publicity. I believe right now, Louisiana, New York, and Tennessee are the ones that have adopted such laws, but others are in the offing. And the fourth is just those bills that require some kind of research or reporting around deepfakes and those sorts of threats. And those occur both at the federal level. There have been a couple bills along those lines, but also at the state level. So I've got a long answer here. So that's sort of like this first category of new narrowly tailored laws. Second, I'll be super brief, is broad laws that might have applicability to AI. And here I'm thinking of these sort of broad data privacy laws, these comprehensive ones. And now there's probably 10 states that have comprehensive data privacy laws. So as in-house lawyers, you would just want to make sure that your in-house use of AI or whatever is consistent with whatever state regime you're subject to. And then the third bit are broad AI laws. The one that I think has gotten the most attention is California, which is looking at it, but other states are too. Over.
So we're going to open it up to questions in a moment. We're going to also flash a couple more polls for folks to answer. One around what aspects of AI do folks believe are most challenging for their business. We'd be curious to know that.
So
as we get answers to that question, though, we do have a question from the chat that I wanted to take on, which I think we've tackled in various ways, but maybe we could put a laser on it, which is Parker asks, would it be accurate to say the government's focus, at least for the moment, is on Gen AI versus AI ML that's non-generative applications in other industries? If I was to summarize what you guys have said, it's sort of, there's a broad focus. There's a focus on things that are both what we would call traditional AI ML and generative, but maybe aspects of this have become more focused given the advancements that we've seen in generative AI. How would you guys, how are policymakers trying to educate themselves? How do they think about teasing apart these differences? Or is it sort of a difference that doesn't matter from a policy perspective? They don't care how the technology works so much as what its impacts and outcomes are.
I can take that first. I do think that as the conversation has progressed, it's been a lot more on what is the impact, what is the use case, and looking more at that. But I would say, and I think there is still some education that's going on and understanding the differences between generative AI versus machine learning. Some of this sometimes comes out in the way that I alluded to this earlier, that definitions are scoped, where sometimes I think it's a little broader than perhaps might be intended. So, but I do think from a legislative perspective, at least with bill ideas that have gone, or like proposed legislation, a lot of it is more focused on generative AI than it is on the broader applications. But for the purposes of conversation, I think it's still kind of an overarching discussion about AI as a technology, and we're still working through those nuances.
I would agree with that. I think that's right. I would just point out that in like the AI executive order, there's certain requirements depending on the power of the AI model, 10 to the 26 flops. So like that, that can be applied to all sorts of different kinds of AI, but generative AI is the thing that people are most worried about when it comes to the actual use cases.
Yeah.
And that's the computing power too. I think also just speaks to how that inflection point we were discussing earlier about how this is just much, much more powerful. And given that has kind of driven the conversation, it's also where a lot of the focus on where we're trying to fill gaps is as well.
One area that's coming up from the poll is people reflecting on data privacy and fraud being key issues for their businesses. Obviously, businesses have had to deal with an increasing patchwork and an increasingly complex data privacy set of regulations globally and at the state-by-state level over the last 5 to 10 years. Do you guys see federal action being taken on that piece in particular to try to provide more of a holistic perspective on data privacy regulation?
It is very hard to know. So I think just about a month or a couple weeks ago, there was a new comprehensive data privacy rule bill that was proposed. And I believe that the House took it up to mark it up. Maybe both chambers ended up marking it up. But whether it actually passes is another question that's outstanding. I think even as we've talked about this with AI, it's just they're very complex issues, and a comprehensive data privacy law would have very broad implications. So I think there's just a lot of issues that are being worked out.
And states are our beloved laboratories of democracy. It does get messy. Where does are there tipping points, you think, where whether it's from disinformation and deep fakes or data privacy, where a patchwork reaches a tipping point where it's just so patchy that the federal government feels compelled to act? Have we seen that in the recent past in any way?
One thing that I will say is interesting. So I think given the emerging tech conversations and knowing that the data privacy issue is also kind of tied to how we can train our AI models, there was an executive order that was focused on data security, which I think would probably feed into a lot of, it's not exactly, but it would feed into these conversations. That is being implemented now. So I think that's also something to watch about how some of those categories are scoped out. But I think, whether there is action is, I think, anybody's guess. But I think there's a lot of discussion around it.
I would just say, Daniel, that I think what tends to happen, and I'm thinking, I don't think I can, nothing comes to mind of an example of where it was like so patchy and then it led to a federal law. I think what is more likely to happen is that people just default to following the most conservative or most broadly applicable law, like maybe it's like the California Data Privacy Act or something like that, and maybe there's an analog in the AI space as well.
Yeah. There's another question from the chat from Scott, which is, what's your sense, if you have one, of whether or how close we are to being able to detect AI-generated images, video, audio, etc.? being able to detect those sorts of created works would potentially help mitigate some of these risks. Do you guys have a perspective on how that's going from a, I don't know, technology development perspective?
I'll give you my quick take. I mean, so basically, when you talk about technological interventions with synthetic media, they come in two kinds, right? The first is what Scott's talking about, which is detection after the fact. Was this piece of media created by machine, or was it not? And if it was created by machine, like what was changed? It's as I understand the art of the technology, state of the art. It's a bit of an arms race. You know, like it used to be pretty easy. You could look to see if the person wasn't blinking, and that was a tip off. Now it's gotten much better, so it does get harder, certainly with your naked eye. But there are detectors, you know, like Meta has one, something called Reality Defender has another, and they look for indicia of falsity. So the short answer is it's an arms race. The second way of dealing with this is not to detect what's phony, but to ensure you know what's real. And this is called digital provenance. And the idea here, in simple terms, is just that you mark the imagery at the point of creation. So if it's taken by a camera, you mark it in the metadata, often with the blockchain, to indicate that it was taken by a camera and this is how it looks. And then if it's ever changed, they're basically breadcrumbs so you can see how it was changed. And then relatedly, there's a move to watermark both visually, i.e. there's like a watermark across it, but also in the metadata when things are created by generative systems. And I believe that OpenAI has said that they're going to do this for all electioneering kinds of material. And so the idea there is that you can still be in a world in which there's lots of synthetic media, but you are going to have the tools to know whether or not it's synthetic or real, basically like a nutrition label for media. So that's the other way of addressing this. Over.
Yeah,
Cool.
just to tack onto that, because I was going to make the same point that's very active conversation in Congress too, is about applying content provenance standards and watermarking, and when it's appropriate, like what types of applications, like what types of content. So I think that's ongoing, and that is one way to track. The other thing, and I don't have a sense of, do we have the solution yet? But I do think that it is, a very active and exciting area to explore, such that I think you're going to see a lot of like startup companies developing niche capabilities to try to fill this void. So I think we're, like Matt said, it's going to be a bit of an arms race, but I think there's going to be a lot of activity and excitement, given that we see this gap for smaller companies coming in and developing really interesting solutions.
Makes sense. And for everyone's benefit, we've shared the results of this most recent poll about the top challenges for businesses. And if you said data privacy, you're not alone. 60% of folks said that as well. So there's actually a lot of issues here that are of concern to folks.
All right, Daniel, I'm gonna step in.
Sure.
I want to just say, first of all, thank you, Daniel, Matthew, and Alexandra, for a wonderful program. Super informative, really interesting, and a lot more on the horizon, a lot more to see and discuss. So it was a pleasure having you all here. Daniel, I want to ask, what can you tell us about LegalOn? We have a huge chunk of the audience is involved in contract review and negotiation, so I think it's super relevant. But would love to hear more about LegalOn and what it does.
Yeah, so LegalOn is a global leader in AI contract review. We help in-house teams handle all of those run the business contracts that come to legal for review before the business signs them. So that could be MSAs and DPAs and BAAs and NDAs, acronym heaven. And what we do is help spot issues in those contracts, language that is missing that should be added, or language that's there that should be deleted because it's not favorable to you. And we'll provide you with suggestions and advice written by our own team of experienced in-house attorneys to help you correct those issues. We can apply technology to make those red lines for you. And we serve over 5,000 customers globally, actually. So if you're interested in learning more, obviously we'd love to chat. As it relates to topics like this, we're broadly concerned with the issues that our in-house customers care about. And so whether it's the IP related to generative AI, whether it's navigating regulatory risks and data privacy concerns, these issues come up for us as we help you handle things like DPAs. So there is a connection here, but we're also just kind of excited to help inform our general audience about these issues as they change so quickly and are top of mind.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I want to kick it back to the panel for final thoughts, remarks on this. I guess, Alexandra, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I'll just say thanks again for having me. I think, as you can see, there's still a lot of there are a lot of questions in this space, and they're going to be continuing to unfold. I think broadly, I can say there is a lot of interest from Congress. I think it's been a lot more in the spirit of Congress, a very deliberative approach in trying to understand these issues before acting. We've seen a lot of members taking interest, and while there are different proposed laws that I think we'll continue to see coming up, I think action is we're still going to be working through a lot of these issues. Some of them are new and we can't even anticipate at this point because the technology is changing at the same time that we're trying to address some of the issues that we either foresee or that we are seeing. So just really want to thank you all. It's a space to monitor. Again, I think AI is as I think you may have gathered from our remarks, it's a transformative, kind of class of technologies that are going to have lots of impacts on the way you do your work, the way we think about work. It's going to be cost saving, effective. So we want to make sure that we're developing and using them in the right ways. So lots of interesting questions and things to monitor in this space, and we'll continue to evolve.
And Alexandra, are there any particular resources or writers in this space that you would encourage folks to follow that you found helpful?
Oh, yeah. I think, honestly, if you're trying to just watch the broader debate, I think there is a lot that's just coming out across the government. So if you're trying to just monitor, I think that's the best. There's going to be a lot of particular researchers who are making advancements in the space that's going to be more technical. I think a lot more of the think tanks around DC, I know, are starting to take on a lot of these broader questions. But I think if you actually look at the documents that are coming out of different parts of the government, that's going to help to just understand where the conversation is going, and what the areas of interest are.
I was just saying thank you all very much. I had a really wonderful time, and buckle up. It's going to be quite a ride.
All right, short and sweet. Daniel, last word.
No, thanks to both Matt and Alexandra. Really appreciate you guys taking time from your work, helping steer the federal government. We appreciate it. We appreciate your work and your service. And we're thankful for you sharing your insights about this rapidly changing space.